This is the second cardiovascular lecture. We're going to be talking about the heart. In this particular file, which is part A, we're going to be talking about cardiac anatomy and the circulatory system in general. In parts B and C, we'll be talking about the details of cardiac muscle and then the details of the conduction system, how the cardiac muscle starts and coordinates its own heartbeat. As mentioned in a previous recording, the heart is actually a pair of pumps, and its job is to apply pressure to blood to get it to push it through the blood vessels. It actually serves a minor endocrine function as well. The heart secretes a hormone called atrial natriuretic peptide, which is involved in regulating urine secretion. We'll talk a little more about that maybe when we get to the urinary system. But for now, what I'd like to do is give you an anatomical overview of the heart and put it in a proper context with the rest of the cardiovascular system. So the heart is a little bit difficult to draw accurately because it has a lot of important three-dimensional structure, so drawing it on a two-dimensional whiteboard is tough. But I'll show you the way I've come up with that I think strikes the best balance I know. So we can start like this. So that's kind of the way I end up doing it. Now, the first thing you can see about the heart like this is that it really consists of two sides that in an adult have no connection. So we've got a left side and a right side. We name these left and right based on anatomical position. So as if you're looking at me, somebody else's heart, and you're talking about my left and my right. So this is my left and my right side of my heart. And in a mature heart, there's no direct connection. These two halves are entirely separate. There is a connection between them before you're born, but that closes basically with your first breath of life. So that's why we sometimes talk about this as being two different pumps. We have one pump on the right and one pump on the left. So each side of the heart is divided into an upper and a lower chamber. The upper chamber, the name is the atrium, that's singular, atria would be plural. And the lower chamber, the ventricle. So we can talk over here about the left atrium and left ventricle, the right atrium and right ventricle. The atria are the chambers that receive blood coming to the heart on veins. The term vein just means a vessel bringing blood toward the heart. So blood comes to the heart in the atria. The ventricles are the chambers which pump blood out of the heart. So these would be major arteries. Artery just means a vessel taking blood away from the heart. Now, the heart also contains a set of valves that prevent blood from going backwards during its trip through the heart. All four of those valves, so there's one set and another set, they're all embedded in this same layer of tough, fibrous connective tissue that we call the base of the heart. So that base goes along here. And all four of these valve openings are embedded in that base. Between the atria and the ventricles, I'll circle them here in green, we have sets of what we call atrioventricular valves. Those are one-way valves that allow the flow of blood from the atria to the ventricles. If I were to look at how one of those valves is set up, if this is the base that it's anchored in, it's made of a set of valve flaps which open downward from atria to ventricles. So blood is allowed to flow down this way, but if blood tries to flow backwards up through this, those valve flaps will get pushed closed and not allow the blood to flow backwards. Now, the atrioventricular valves, the simplest name to use is just the left or right atrioventricular valve. I'll sometimes also say AV valve, which is different from AV node, but we'll get to that. However, there are some other names you should be aware of. The left atrioventricular valve is also known as the bicuspid valve because it has two valve flaps, or the mitral valve. It's also the mitral valve because it actually looks a little bit like the mitre cap worn by the Pope and some bishops in the Catholic Church. The right atrioventricular valve, I guess I just do this over here, is also known as the tricuspid valve because it has three flaps. And I guess it didn't look enough like a hat for anyone to give it another name. So this base of the heart also contains two other sets of valves. Let's see, let's do these in red. So here and here. These are the valves that separate the ventricles from the arteries. We call these the, let's see, I can erase this stuff just to give myself a little more room here. We call these the semilunar valves. Because of the way that their flaps are shaped. Let me just put up an image really quickly of the heart valve so you can see how they're shaped. This is a cross through the base of the heart. So here you can see the three flaps of the tricuspid valve, the two flaps of the bicuspid valves, and the semilunar valves with their three flaps each. Now these semilunar valves are also one-way valves, making sure that blood can only flow from the ventricles into the arteries. They work sort of like the atrioventricular valves. They have valve flaps which open outward when blood is flowing from ventricles to arteries, but if blood tries to flow backward, the valve flaps close and don't allow backflow of blood. Like the atrioventriculars, you can always call them the left and right semilunar valves, but they also do have other names. The left semilunar valve is also known as the aortic valve because the major artery that it leads to is also known as the aorta. And the right semilunar valve is also known as the pulmonary valve because it leads to the pulmonary arteries. So now that we know all of that, we can put the heart into a more general context. So let me go ahead and erase the rest of this stuff. Okay, good. Now, let's put this in context. So let's follow how blood is going to go if we start here in the left ventricle. So if I imagine starting in the left ventricle, I'm going to pass outward through the left semilunar valve into the main artery that leads to most of the body. That artery is called the aorta. That aorta splits off into many other arteries. We're not going to draw this in a way that's anatomically accurate. This is really just a schematic. So this splits up into many other arteries, which together supply pretty much everything in the body except the lungs. So all of the body cells and tissues from head to toe, but not the lungs. That collectively we're going to call the systemic circulation. Sometimes the systemic circuit. So this is the overall the systemic arteries. The blood goes out from those to the systemic circulation, out to all of our organs and tissues except the lungs. Then it's going to come back together in the systemic veins, which are going to be returning to the right atrium of the heart. Those actually come together into two large veins. The superior vena cava, which drains everything from the head, neck, shoulders, arms, basically everything above the diaphragm, everything down to kind of the chest level. And the inferior vena cava, which drains everything from the feet and legs and trunk all the way up to the diaphragm, so pretty much from abdomen down. I'm not going to draw those both on here because this is sort of a schematic rather than an anatomically accurate diagram. So we're just going to summarize this as the venae cavae, which is the proper Latin plural for vena cava, meant to represent both of them. So blood going from the left ventricle goes to the systemic arteries, to the systemic circulation, comes back on the systemic veins, to the right atrium. The right atrium passes that blood to the right ventricle through the right atrioventricular or tricuspid valve. The right ventricle passes that blood out through the right semilunar or pulmonary valve into the pulmonary arteries, which are going to lead to the other branch of the circulatory system, which we call the pulmonary circulation. And that covers the lungs. So this is the blood going to the lungs for gas exchange. Coming back from that, we return from the pulmonary circulation on the pulmonary veins to the left atrium of the heart, from the left atrium down through the left atrioventricular or bicuspid or mitral valve into the left ventricle, and that's where we started. So you can see that blood goes through a circuit that goes through both of these circulations on every round. If you start at one side of the heart, you end up coming back to the other side of the heart, and then back to that first side of the heart again. So any given bit of blood is going to go through both sides of this circuit in one round through the body. Now, another way that sometimes helps to look at this is to think of it in terms of blood that's rich in oxygen or poor in oxygen. Sometimes we say oxygenated or deoxygenated, but that can be a little bit misleading because deoxygenated blood is actually still about 75% saturated with oxygen under most circumstances. So let me erase these arrows just for a moment. And let's trace this blood flow, also keeping in mind the idea of oxygenated or deoxygenated. So starting in the same place we did before, the left ventricle. The blood in here is rich with oxygen, which I'll represent as red. So red is oxygenated blood. That blood, passing through these systemic arteries, goes to the systemic circulation. And in the systemic circulation, that blood is giving its oxygen to the tissues. So it's going to come away from that relatively poor in oxygen. I'll put that in blue. Oxygen poor blood. Now, do remember that, first of all, oxygen poor blood is still actually about 3/4 saturated under most circumstances. It's also not actually blue. If you've ever had blood drawn from a vein, which probably most of you have, you've seen that that blood is sort of a reddish purple color. That's the color of the poor oxygenated blood. Well oxygenated blood is bright red, which is, if you've ever seen arterial bleeding, you've seen that. Hopefully you haven't seen much of that unless you work in a hospital. Anyway, so our blood that's poor in oxygen is coming back from the systemic circulation through the systemic veins to the right atrium, passes from there through the right atrioventricular valve to the right ventricle, out through the right semilunar valve into the pulmonary arteries. Now it's on its way to the lungs. And here in the lungs, it's going to get rid of carbon dioxide and pick up oxygen, which means when it comes back from the lungs, it's going to be bright red, well-oxygenated blood. So that's now coming back to the left atrium, through the left atrioventricular valve to the left ventricle. And we've completed our circuit. One other piece of useful information you can get from this. We often think of, when people say oxygenated blood, they think arterial blood. They think that because most of the time when we think of arteries, we're thinking of systemic arteries, and systemic arteries do carry well-oxygenated blood. But actually, arterial blood and oxygenated blood are not the same thing. Take a look here. The pulmonary arteries carry poorly oxygenated blood. Likewise, while the systemic veins carry poor oxygen blood, the pulmonary veins carry well-oxygenated blood. So when people think about oxygenated blood and arterial blood being the same thing, and deoxygenated and venous blood being the same thing, that's because they're thinking of the systemic circulation, which is most of it. But do keep in mind that for the pulmonary circulation, it's reversed as to whether arteries or veins carry well oxygenated or poorly oxygenated blood. Now, fair warning. For the exam for this unit, I am going to ask you a question, something like, starting at some place in here, name the chambers and valves of the heart you would pass through going back to that same location. So if, for example, I said, starting in the pulmonary arteries, name the chambers and valves of the heart that you would pass through, you could use this information to answer that. Just as a preview, if you think, pulmonary arteries, where am I going to go from there? Arteries are going away from the heart, so that goes to the pulmonary circulation. And I know that comes back to the left atrium of the heart, so I'm going to go left atrium, then I pass through the left atrioventricular valve to the left ventricle, which goes out through the left semilunar valve to the systemic arteries. That comes back eventually to the right atrium, which goes through the right atrioventricular valve to the right ventricle, to the right semilunar, and back to the pulmonary arteries. So that's the kind of thinking you'll need to do for that question.